Aren't you a little tired of so-called horror media about shiny, sparkly, angsty, whiny monsters? I know I am, and that's why I created Actual Fucking Monsters, where you will play an actual fucking monster doing horrible and monstrous things and being tracked down and killed for it. Buy now at DriveThruRPG, post-mort.com or lulu.com.
Well, the Games Expo controversy continues to roll on, and in the same usual predictable fashion that it always does. And this poor sod basically has no recourse or right of reply, and a lot of that comes down to his gender and skin colour and all the rest of it. And the libertine, the liberal, the creatively sympathetic position, which is mine, attracts almost as much vitriol as daring to have horror things in a horror game has. Now, to reiterate my nuanced position, he probably should have put more content warning, I suppose. Not necessarily because he had to. He did label the game horror and 18 plus, which strikes me as being more than sufficient in any normal sane world, but we don't live in a normal sane world, and running that kind of game at a convention probably should have known that something like this would happen, and probably should have put more content warning on it, which is defeat, I suppose, for creativity, but less defeat than some other options, which are now attempting to be swung into effect, and more censorship, more control. There's a suite of other issues around this, like paying for games at conventions, which is a practice of which I do not approve. Public gaming, adult gaming, people wanting to censor and control miniatures, artwork, everything else. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on. But rather than continue to whine about the people that are whining, I want to offer some sane and sensible solutions that don't involve censorship or killing off a whole swathe of the hobby that happens to be into horror or pin-up art or whatever else it might be that these horrible people find so objectionable that they will torch someone's life over it. X cards are not a solution. They are disruptive, they are disrespectful to the games master, and they're unnecessary. If you have that strong an issue with something at the game, the solution is simply to speak up, tell the games master, or absent yourself from the table. Right? Formalizing all of this with lines and veils and X cards, and even demanding that these things be employed at conventions, which is starting to happen with some American conventions, it's disrespectful. It's rude, it's disruptive, it's not conducive to immersive play, to good games. Now, taking my assumptions that we want to allow horror content, and we want this stuff to happen, that no genre or style of play should be unwelcome at any convention, we're kind of hemmed in a bit in what solutions we can have. But the first thing I would say is that you need to decouple the convention from the games to an extent. So stop charging people to play games, and you no longer bear any responsibility for the game content. That may mean you can't offer free attendance or free accommodation or free food or whatever it is that you offer to people who volunteer to Games Master. But so fucking what? The important part here is the games and people's freedom to run and play the games that they want. So you should have no monetary connection, and you should have no official oversight whatsoever. It's kind of sinister, the idea that someone's game scenario has to be run past the commissar for political orthodoxy before you will allow them to present it to the workers. Yeah, it's just a little... No, it's a lot sinister. So, X cards aren't the solution. first step is to distance yourself from the content. What else can you do? Conventions never used to try and sell themselves as family friendly, and I think that is another part of the creeping issue that we're starting to see around conventions. I mean, role-playing really took off once it was into the universities. Yeah, that's where it took off. So these were young adults and above playing these games for the vast and overwhelming part. Even when there was a kind of push, I guess, to get younger people into it, it was still the kind of teenage and above bracket. And teenagers are the kinds of people who run the edgiest content, so we don't actually need to worry about them, but apparently convention staff and so on do feel the need to worry about it. Now, a solution that some people have suggested, which isn't possible for all conventions, but is possible for some, is to have a designated adult area. Now, that could well be a useful solution, and those vendors who sell more adult material, those people who want to play more adult games, those who want to play more horrific games or games with more sexual content or whatever it might be, and that's a lot of indie games, they could have their own space at a convention, a particular hall designated for them or whatever. The other option, which is less than ideal, is for adult conventions to be a thing, for separate conventions that cater to the horror and sexier market to be set up as smaller independent conventions. Now, 18 plus strikes me as too high. If you look at the rules around a 15 rating of a film in the UK, for example, that would seem to me to be the kind of spot that you'd be aiming for, because sexual themes become more overt at the age of 15 and violence is more acceptable in movies. Even cartoonishly gratuitous violence is more acceptable in movies at 15. But enforcement then becomes an issue, because easy access to a way of confirming your identity and your age usually doesn't come about until 18 or higher. So split the difference, less than ideal. 18 plus cons, 18 plus areas, that's one way to potentially deal with the problem. The other thing that we can work on, I think, is managing people's expectations. So, for me, when I see an 18 plus rated game in the genre of horror, I expect horrible things to happen within the context of the game. Content warnings often go over the edge into spoilers, and a game is less enjoyable when you know what is going to happen. Sometimes it's not avoidable. I mean, if you have a game called Into the Spider Temple of the Spider People, anyone who comes to the table and then complains and shrieks and runs away because they have arachnophobia clearly isn't paying attention. But age ratings and genres don't seem to be enough for some people. So what I would suggest is that, as well as the kind of standard, well understood age ratings that people often put on games, the one that's kicked off all this fuss, it was clearly labelled horror and 18 plus. That doesn't seem to have been enough, so I would suggest that we reintroduce or start using the X rating. So reserve that for potentially disturbing or problematic content, and also have an explanation poster or something explaining what each of the age ratings might mean next to the sign-in desk or on the same board as the sign-in sheets or wherever it might be, so that people have a clearer understanding and no excuse for being shocked when they go to a horror game labelled 18 plus and some 18 plus horrific things happen there. So, to reiterate, there are problems with the solutions that people are already suggesting, and there are problems with burning someone's life down for making a social faux pas in running their game. That's an extreme and outrageous response to such a thing. People are advocating for the lines, veils, X cards, all of that stuff, but those are disruptive and rude and unnecessarily impinge on people's creativity. The same thing goes for having your scenarios subjected to approval by the Politburo before you can go ahead and play them. These are all disruptive, they're anti-creative, and people are also asking for more censorship of things like miniatures, certain books, and so on. Yeah, you give these people an inch, they take a mile. As with most of these things, I think the best option is to put more power into the hands of the players themselves, not to disrupt the game, but to understand what they're getting into, but without spoiling it. So I would suggest an 18 plus designated area at conventions and an X rating, and require all games to be rated U, PG, 12, 15, 18 or X. That way you can get a general idea without spoilers of what kind of content will be in a game, and consent takes place when you sign up to a game, when you sit down to the table, and when you don't say this isn't for me. That's where the consent is. I don't know why people are so confused by that, or why people are so confused at the difference between players and characters. But here we are. It is indeed Clown World, it would seem, and that's deeply unfortunate. Anyway, there's my solutions, some of which mulled over and culled from comments on previous videos, and I recommend them to you all. Zang.